The call came on a rainy night, one of those where the wind seems to whisper ancient truths through the cracks in the windows. Helena was already in her pajamas, a cup of warm tea in hand, her eyes lost in the emptiness of the small apartment she had called home for the past 2 years. When she answered the phone, the voice on the other end was direct, professional, almost urgent. There was no small talk, a unique opportunity, an above-average salary, immediate work, no time to overthink. The offer was to care for a comatose patient in a mansion far from the city. The family name was not disclosed, just an address in Petropolis, a scheduled time just a few hours away, and the promise of a new chance for someone who had already given up on almost everything. The car sent by the family arrived with tinted windows, and the driver asked no questions. Helena felt her heart beating in rhythm with the rain against the glass, a restlessness born from the unknown, and something deeper, an ancient intuition she had learned not to ignore, though she could never quite explain it. The winding road felt like it was taking her out of time. As they approached the mansion, the fog thickened, as if the world itself was trying to hide that place from the rest of reality. The Donati mansion rose imposingly among the hills, an echo of an era that no longer existed. Its white walls reflected the headlights with a ghostly glow. The iron gate creaked as if reluctant to open, and the flowered gardens, even at night, exuded a bittersweet fragrance that flirted with memory. Helena stepped out of the car with hesitant steps, feeling the damp ground give way beneath her feet. A housekeeper was waiting at the door, a woman with a neutral expression and impeccable posture, who simply gestured the way. Everything happened quickly, efficiently, and with unsettling silence. The interview didn't feel like an interview. No questions about her past, no formal requirements, just a contract on the table and the order. If you accept, you may start now. Helena hesitated. The amount was unreal for the nature of the job. But there was something about that place, that night, that offer, something that felt stitched together by a fate she no longer knew whether to fear or long to encounter again. Her hand trembled as she signed. The paper absorbed her decision like a pact being sealed. And then finally, she was led to the patient's room. They climbed an old staircase, its steps creaking under the weight of unspoken memories. The hallway was long, lined with portraits of a noble and forgotten lineage. At the end, a white door with wooden carved details. When they opened it, time seemed to hold its breath. The room was spacious, soberly decorated, and a piano sat in the corner, covered in a veil of fine dust. Long curtains filtered the light from a lamp, casting soft shadows across the furniture. In the center, a large bed, and on it, the man, Adrian, a name yet to be revealed to her. Eyes closed, serene expression, and sharp features, he had the quiet beauty of someone who had once lived intensely. Even motionless, there was something about his presence that dominated the space, a kind of involuntary magnetism. But what sent chills down Helena's spine wasn't his appearance. It was the inexplicable sense of familiarity. She didn't know him. She was sure of it, but her body reacted as if it recognized that face, as if, somewhere between life and dreams, they had already met. A shiver ran down her neck when her eyes fell on his hands. There was a dormant firmness in them, as if they were about to move, and for a moment, just one, she swore she saw his eyelashes tremble, too fast to be real, strong enough to leave her frozen, her heart racing. She stood there for long seconds, feeling the weight of silence and the subtle calling emanating from that room. This wasn't just a job. Deep down, she knew she was facing something that would change everything, that this man, even unconscious, held answers she didn't even know she was searching for. And even without understanding why, she accepted the job, not out of necessity, but from a primal instinct, as if telling herself, this is where it all begins again. Helena lived in a back room of an old boarding house in the city center, where the smell of mold mingled with the scent of cheap coffee drifting from the shared kitchen during quiet mornings. The bed creaked with every movement, and the crooked closet door held more memories than clothes. It was there, in that cramped space, that she fought daily to keep the last spark of dignity alive. Her routine was dictated by extreme frugality, dinners replaced with black tea and broken biscuits, showers timed to save gas, and lights almost always off to reduce the electric bill. Each month, the little she earned working odd shifts as a caregiver for the elderly barely covered the essentials, and the rest, if there was any, was set aside for a debt she hadn't incurred, but embraced as an inheritance of love. After her grandmother's death, Helena discovered a stack of overdue bills hidden in a shoebox under the bed. Electricity, water, medication, credit cards, all in the name of a woman who had given her everything but passed in silence, unable to admit she was struggling. The sweet, smiling old lady with gentle eyes who made homemade sweets to sell at the fair had fallen ill in secret, avoiding hospitals for fear of creating expenses. When she left more than just longing. She left a silent guilt that gnawed at Helena night after night. She wondered why she hadn't seen it sooner, why she hadn't insisted more, why she hadn't dropped everything to stay by her side when the signs began to appear. Since then, the 28-year-old carried the weight of the world on her shoulders, trying to make up for absences and rebuild broken promises. Dreams? They were postponed. Her greatest wish was to study physical therapy, work in clinics, help people recover. But college tuition seemed unreachable in the face of her bills, and she learned to bury her desires to feed her responsibilities. Her only distraction was the old books inherited from her grandmother, where she would immerse herself in other lives to forget, for a few hours, her own. It was in those moments, lying on a sunken mattress with a flashlight in hand, that quiet tears would escape and silently trace their way across yellowed pages. The new job offer seemed too good to be true, but maybe that was exactly it. One last breath before sinking for good. Still, even with a grateful heart, Helena felt apprehension growing inside her. She knew the pain of getting too involved. She knew the price of caring, of giving everything to someone, and in the end, losing. Caring for a man in a coma, with no idea for how long, was like placing herself in the center of an emotional storm. It meant being present and invisible at the same time, offering affection with no return, and she feared that, by giving herself again, she might reopen a wound that had barely begun to heal. In the first few nights at the mansion, between warm baths and meals offered with discreet refinement, Helena realized just how exhausted she was. Not just physically, but at her core. It was as if the past few years had drained her of all color, and now, in that strange and sophisticated place, she saw herself, for the first time in a long while, as someone alive again. But the fear remained, between the cracks of the old floor and the walls steeped in stories. The fear of growing attached, of caring, of becoming invested in someone who might never open his eyes to thank her. Still, even with her heart tight, she chose to stay, because deep down, loneliness hurts too, and maybe, just maybe, caring for someone was her last chance to care for herself. Adrian had been motionless for weeks, maybe months, breathing with the help of discreet machines that emitted regular hypnotic sounds. His face, despite its pallor, maintained strong features, as if life itself resisted fully leaving him. The room where he lay was spacious and quiet, with light linen curtains and old dark wood furniture that seemed to hold too many memories. Helena spent part of her days caring for his body, massaging his muscles, changing the sheets, applying creams and precisely prescribed medications. But over time, she began to wonder who this man was. Who had he been before the fall, the silence, the emptiness, on sleepless nights, when the clock marked indecent hours, and the mansion seemed to breathe on its own? Helena would sit in the armchair beside the bed and watch Adrian. Sometimes, she swore she saw his hand move. Other times, she believed his eyelashes trembled. But they were just illusions, perhaps the product of her own emotional loneliness. Until one day, while discreetly exploring the most remote wing of the house, a hallway with heavy doors and old locks, she found an office that seemed frozen in time. Leather-bound books, framed photos, old maps, newspaper clippings, and on the desk, a carved wooden box. Inside it were carefully organized letters, all written by the same person, Adrian. The letters spoke of a search, an obsession, a name repeated on every page like a mantra. Anna. Who was she? A sister, a lost love, an emotional debt never repaid. Between the lines, Helena found clues, references to an orphanage in the countryside, mentions of missing children, and a clear pain hidden in the words of a man used to control but devastated by an absence that consumed him. There was also an old yellowed photograph of a group of children in front of a simple-looking big house. Helena froze when she saw the image. Her eyes went straight to the bottom right corner, where a dark-haired girl with a shy expression held a stuffed rabbit. She knew that place, that child, that memory. It was her, the same girl who had grown up in a long-forgotten orphanage, where the smell of thin soup mixed with the sound of bedtime prayers. How did Adrian have that photo? Why was he writing about that orphanage? Why was he looking for someone from that past she had believed long buried? In the following days, every detail in the mansion seemed to gain new meaning. Helena began searching more carefully, as if trying to assemble a puzzle whose pieces had been deliberately scattered over time. There were more photos, more letters, notes in journals, newspaper clippings about suspicious adoptions, and even a folder with documents that appeared to belong to a personal investigation. Everything pointed to Adrian searching for someone he had lost long ago, someone with whom he had a deep bond, torn from his life by forces beyond his control. Maybe he had been close to finding her when the accident happened. Maybe he had discovered something he shouldn't have. Or maybe he knew more about Helena than she ever imagined. The contrast between the sleeping man before her and the determined figure portrayed in the letters and documents created a chasm. But at the same time, a silent connection was born. He was in a coma, but his presence felt alive, pulsing, almost unsettling. Helena felt that this man had much more to do with her past than she could have imagined. And with every discovery, the mystery became more intimate, more dangerous, more inevitable. Rain pounded furiously against the mansion's stained glass windows, as if the sky were trying to purge a secret buried under layers of silence. Thunder echoed through the thick walls, and each flash of lightning lit up the dark hallways with a ghostly glow. Helena, wearing the thick sweater she had inherited from her grandmother, was exhausted. She had spent the entire day caring for Adrian, cleaning the room, changing the sheets, adjusting the machines, and, as always, trying to understand why that man in a coma felt so present, so aware, even while motionless. She felt as if something in him was watching her, even with his eyes closed. That night, perhaps lulled by the comforting sound of the storm or the accumulated exhaustion, she allowed herself something rare: to stay. She pulled the armchair closer to the bed, brought a light blanket, and sat there, feet tucked under her, her head resting on her crossed arms atop the bed. She watched Adrian's chest rise and fall with serenity, almost hypnotized by that steady rhythm, as if it were the only real sound in the world. The subtle scent of lavender from the cream she had applied to his hands still lingered in the air. Without realizing it, her eyes grew heavy, and she fell asleep. Time unraveled. The wind violently rustled the curtains, and the creaks of the old woodwork sounded like distant whispers. Suddenly, something broke the harmony of the night. A hoarse, fragile sound, yet unmistakably human. Almost a whisper weighed down with effort, as if it came from far away. Helena. The voice was low, raspy, but real. So real that it made her body jolt. Helena opened her eyes, heart racing, muscles tense. For a moment, she thought she was still dreaming. She sat upright and looked directly at Adrian's face. Nothing. His eyes remained closed, his body still. The same silence filled the room. But she was sure. It wasn't a delusion. He had said her name. She heard it. She felt it. Her instinct was to get closer. Her fingers trembled as she lightly touched his arm, as if physical contact could confirm what her ears already knew. But Adrian didn't respond. No movement. No new sound. Only the steady rhythm of assisted breathing and the faint beeping of the machines. What did it mean? How could he know her name? Had he read her documents? Had someone told him before the accident? Or was there something deeper and unexplainable behind that connection? The rest of the night passed without sleep. Helena remained in the armchair, alert to every sound, every faint breath, waiting for something else to happen. But nothing more came. Only the repetition of the storm, the ticking of the wall clock, and the muffled sound of her own racing heart. The next morning, she tried to convince herself that maybe it had all been an illusion caused by exhaustion, but deep down, something had changed. A line had been crossed. She was no longer just the caregiver of a stranger. Now, there was something between them, something inexplicable, unsettling, and impossible to ignore. As the days passed, Helena stopped seeing that room as the space of an unconscious stranger. Gradually, it became a refuge, not just for Adrian, but for her as well. It began with simple gestures. Every morning, even before breakfast, she would walk through the mansion's garden, where the roses resisted the season's cold. She picked the most vibrant one and placed it in a glass vase on the dresser beside the bed. Red, white, or yellow, the flowers broke the room's pale tone and brought life to the silence. It was as if she were trying to remind the sleeping man that the world was still blooming outside, and he could return to it whenever he wished. Helena also started bringing books. Each week, she picked a new title: old romances, childhood tales, even poems. She would sit in the armchair and read softly, for no one but him. Sometimes she lost herself in the words, forgetting there was no reply. At times, she imagined he was there, listening, following each page with the invisible eyes of consciousness. And over time, she began to speak to him as if it were normal. She talked about the weather, about her backaches, about the strange note she found in the attic of the boarding house. Sometimes she laughed to herself, embarrassed, but she kept going. It was less about being heard and more about not feeling alone. The mansion had a piano in the living room, an old grand instrument that seemed forgotten for years. One quiet afternoon, after cleaning the room and changing the sheets, Helena sat on the dusty bench and ran her fingers over the keys. They were out of tune, but still alive. She played a gentle melody by ear, one her grandmother used to sing to lull her to sleep. She left the door to the room open so the sound could reach Adrian's room. That became a tradition. 3 times a week, she played songs she knew by heart. Lullabies, slow waltzes, improvised pieces. Sometimes she felt the air shift when she played, as if something in him reacted, even if imperceptibly. With time, everything settled into a routine that belonged to just the two of them. The changing of flowers, the readings, the whispered conversations, the music floating through the house. And although he never opened his eyes, Helena felt she was not alone there. There was a presence, faint, silent, but real. It was as if that man in a coma offered her a silent ear, a companion who asked for nothing, an invisible comfort, and perhaps without realizing it, she was healing. The old wounds, the losses never overcome, the corrosive loneliness. Everything began to dissolve in the affection she poured onto that motionless body. Even without a response, she felt seen, and that was enough. In the beginning, Helena followed the books as they were written. She chose classic novels, old editions with yellowed pages and worn covers, borrowed from the town's small library. She read in a low voice, pausing at the denser passages, almost as if she were waiting for some reaction. Sometimes, she would place the palm of her hand on the blanket, near his arm, in an unconscious gesture of closeness. When she read about love, she would hesitate, feeling a lump in her throat she couldn't explain. There was something unsettling about speaking of such deep feelings in front of someone who couldn't respond, but she didn't stop. Something inside her needed to keep going. Over time, though, the books began to feel too distant. The stories seemed cold, disconnected from their reality. Then one afternoon, after finishing the reading of a melancholic Russian tale, she looked at Adrian and quietly said she had a better idea, and she began to invent. She spoke of a little girl who lived in a flower field and had a rabbit that disappeared every time she cried. She spoke of a grandmother who baked cakes that could heal sadness. She told of a cabin on top of a hill where people could sleep for 1,000 years and wake up without any pain. She made it all up and spoke as if it were real, as if she were telling it not to him, but to herself, to the child that still lived inside her chest. Those stories weren't just creations. They were fragments of a childhood she had buried under layers of pain and forgetfulness. As she told them, memories began to resurface. The old house where she lived with her grandmother. The cloudy days when she and her sister would hide under the blankets, sharing made-up secrets. Her sister's voice, soft, protective, came from a time she thought had been lost forever. The orphanage, the separation, the unkept promises. Each invented story was a crack opening in her soul, allowing forgotten memories to seep through like faint light breaking through the fractures. She spoke, and as she did, she cried in silence, not desperate tears, but the kind that slide slowly when the heart remembers what it tried to forget. Adrian, even in his deep silence, seemed to be the only one capable of listening without judgment, of embracing without saying a word. He was an involuntary listener, but a present one. With each new story, Helena felt closer to him, not because he reacted, but because she was allowing herself to be seen, even if only by someone who could not open his eyes. That intimacy, built through words and memories, was a rare kind of bond, silent, poetic, almost sacred. And so, the once cold room became a stage for invisible worlds. Worlds where time turned back, where wounds found a voice, and where two strangers, separated by a coma and hidden pasts, built an invisible bridge made of stories, memories, and the quiet hope that maybe pain could be transformed into something new. That night, the rain fell heavily, as if the sky had decided to collapse along with what Helena could no longer carry inside herself. The windows of the mansion trembled with the sound of thunder, and the lights flickered now and then, casting restless shadows through the hallways. In the room, however, there was only silence, except for the ticking of the old clock on the wall and the steady sound of Adrian's monitored breathing. Helena sat at the edge of the bed, shoulders hunched, eyes red from exhaustion and unspoken emotions. Something inside her, after weeks of shared silence, was finally breaking. She held in her hands a small, faded hair ribbon, one of the few objects she had kept from her sister, who had died years before under circumstances that still ate away at her soul. It was the first time she had brought that object near Adrian, maybe because, deep down, she felt he deserved to know who she really was, maybe because she was just too tired to keep pretending to be strong. Without lifting her eyes, she began to speak. Her voice, hoarse and low, trembled. She spoke of her childhood in the orphanage, of how she and her sister protected each other from the world around them. She told of the day they were separated, of the emptiness she felt not seeing her anymore in the cafeteria, or in the bed beside hers. She spoke of the brief reunion, years later, already marked by the harsh experiences of life. And finally, she spoke of her sister's death, sudden, unjust, silent. She said she was never the same after that she hated herself for not having been there, for not doing more, for surviving when the only person who gave her life meaning was gone. Each word was a knife reopening a wound that had never truly healed. The tears came without warning, first timid, then abundant. They ran hot down her face, falling onto her clasped hands. She no longer tried to hide them. For the first time since she had started that job, she allowed herself to cry in front of him, not as a caregiver, not as an employee, but as someone broken, someone who desperately needed to be heard. It was in that moment that something almost imperceptible happened. A movement, small, faint. Adrian's fingers twitched, a slight tremble, as if the body, until then dormant, was responding to the shared pain. Helena didn't notice it right away, but when she looked at him, eyes still full of tears, she saw the hand slightly out of place. Her eyes widened, her heart racing. She leaned in, held his hand, searched for confirmation. Nothing else happened. The silence returned, and she doubted herself. Maybe it was just a reflex, an involuntary spasm, but something had changed. It was as if, by opening her soul, she had touched a part of him that had until then remained unreachable. The room no longer felt the same. There was a tension in the air, almost sacred, a connection that deepened beyond logic, beyond reason. And that night, amid her vulnerability, Helena felt, for the first time, that perhaps she wasn't as alone as she had imagined. Time inside the mansion seemed to obey a different logic. Cloudy days passed like hours, and entire nights stretched into silent eternities. Helena no longer had to remind herself to follow her daily routines. They had become an extension of her own body. She changed the flowers as if oxygenating her soul, read as if seeking comfort, played the piano with her eyes closed, allowing the notes to drift through the hallways until they found their destination. The room where Adrian lay, motionless, yet still present. It was on a gray afternoon, while changing the bed sheets, that something new happened. She approached to adjust his hand over the blanket, a routine gesture, repeated 1,000 times. But this time, as she touched his skin, she felt a slight pressure in return, almost imperceptible, but real. The shock was immediate. Helena froze, her eyes fixed on the hand intertwined with hers. She waited. The moment passed. Maybe it was her imagination. Maybe she was seeing what she wanted to see. But deep down, something whispered. It wasn't an illusion. In the days that followed, other signs began to appear. All small, almost timid, as if Adrian were slowly trying to return from a very distant place. During a reading, Helena noticed a deeper sigh, as if something in the story touched him in an unexplainable way. On another night, while organizing the books on the room's shelf, she noticed that his eyes, though still closed, moved gently under his eyelids. And on a quiet late afternoon, as she played the piano, she felt the frequency of the monitors beside him shift with the melody. It was as if they were communicating through invisible channels. Helena, both frightened and in awe, told no one. She kept those moments as a sacred secret between the two of them. She was afraid that, by speaking them aloud, everything would vanish, like a dream upon waking. And more than that, she felt those reactions were hers, as if her presence, her voice, her gestures were creating an opening in the darkness where he dwelled. It was too intimate, too delicate to share with the world. In that room, between books read in whispers and music that traveled through walls, something ancient and unexplainable was being rebuilt. The miracle wasn't loud or sudden. It was a thin thread of hope woven with silence, care, and a connection that defied reason. And even without promises, even without guarantees, Helena began to believe he was coming back, slowly, for her, with her. Helena's routine in the mansion was always silent, almost liturgical. Every corner of the house seemed to have its own sense of time, and Adrian's office, locked until then, was only opened after she earned a certain degree of trust from the administrator. They told her it held nothing but old papers, forgotten documents, nothing useful. But curiosity proved stronger. The key turned with difficulty in the lock, as if resisting the opening. The smell of aged wood and dusty books filled the air the moment the door creaked open. It was a dark room, where time seemed to have stopped. Tall bookshelves, a desk cluttered with papers, framed photos. There was also a worn leather box hidden beneath a pile of disorganized folders. Helena carefully pulled it out. Inside, she found a bundle of folded letters, some torn in half, others crumpled, as if they had been written in a rush and then rejected. The handwriting was firm, elegant, but heavy with urgency. Each line was an attempt at confession. Unspoken words, unresolved feelings, questions that had never found answers. She read a few, trying not to feel like an intruder. The first one seemed addressed to an unknown figure, always referred to simply as you, a lost love, a distant relative, a ghost from the past. The letters spoke of searching, of regret, of sleepless nights, and the longing for reunion. It was like hearing Adrian's voice for the first time, from the past, full of anguish and yearning. But then, one letter stood out. It had been torn in half, then carefully taped back together with clear tape. The paper was yellowed, and the name at the top made Helena's heart freeze. For Helena. She read it again, her hands trembling. That handwriting, that signature at the end. It was real. The letter was addressed to her. The content was confusing, as if he were trying to explain something he himself didn't fully understand. He spoke of a vague memory, of a girl in an orphanage, of eyes he had never forgotten. He said he needed to find her, that he felt their destinies had yet to be fulfilled. He said time was an enemy, but the feeling remained. Helena let the letter fall onto the desk and stepped back, her chest tight. How could he know her? She had never seen him before, at least not consciously. Could it have been a coincidence? Or were they truly connected by a past she had blocked out? The floor felt unstable beneath her feet. Everything she thought she knew about her presence there took on a new layer of mystery. She sat in the armchair, the letter in her hands, feeling watched by the walls lined with books. This changed everything. Or perhaps it was only revealing what had always been there, hidden beneath the veil of time and silence. The room remained bathed in soft shadows, where the ticking of the clock sounded louder than it should. Outside, the wind stirred the trees, casting dancing shadows across the wall. Helena sat in the armchair near Adrian's bed with a book in her hands, a small volume of poems she had found forgotten on the music room shelf. It was one of those old books, with a worn cover and yellowed pages that seemed to hold memories within the paper. She opened to a page marked by a dried petal. The poem spoke of cycles, of death and rebirth, of silences that announce new beginnings. Her voice came out low, almost reverent as she read. With each verse, she felt as if invisible words were filling the once empty room. When she reached the final stanza, which spoke of a sleeping heart waiting for spring to beat once more. She felt something strange in the air, as if the atmosphere had grown denser, more alive. She slowly lifted her eyes. That's when she saw it. A tear was running down Adrian's face. She stopped reading. The book slipped into her lap, and for a moment, she couldn't move. The silence was absolute, as if the world had paused its breath. With trembling fingers, she leaned closer, bending over him. She observed closely, her heart pounding, her whole body charged with a subtle electricity. The tear continued its path down his temple, a thread of salt and emotion coming from a place unknown. With extreme delicacy, she touched his face, collecting that solitary tear with the tip of her fingers. His skin was warm. There was a heat there that wasn't just physical. It was the presence of someone who no longer seemed distant. Helena didn't know what it meant. An involuntary spasm? An echo of the poem? A silent miracle? But a certainty was growing inside her with a force she could no longer ignore. She was no longer alone in that room. Something had awakened. Something beyond the body. Something between souls. And for the first time since accepting that unlikely job, she didn't feel like a caretaker, or a guest, or an intruder. She felt like part of something greater. There, in the sacred half-light of that room, a story she didn't yet understand was beginning to write itself, without words, but with truths that ran too deep to be spoken. The water ran from the faucet with a steady, hypnotic sound. Helena rested her hands on the cold marble sink, her gaze fixed on the mirror in front of her. The mansion's bathroom was spacious and elegant, but she rarely allowed herself to look in that mirror. There was something about the mirrors in that house that made her feel exposed, as if the walls were watching more than she was. But that night, something made her pause. When she lifted her eyes, she didn't just see the tired woman she knew. There was something different there. The yellowish light reflected softly on her features, and her eyes, though weary, seemed to carry a discreet, almost shy glow. That's when she noticed. She was smiling, not a forced smile, the kind drawn out of politeness or habit. It was a spontaneous smile, small and serene, like someone who carries a secret too beautiful to share with the world. Helena leaned back slightly from the mirror, surprised at herself. She brought her fingers to her lips, as if to confirm that the gesture had truly happened. And it had. There, in that silent bathroom, far from the city's noise and the weight of responsibilities, she realized a truth she had been avoiding. Something inside her was changing. A gentle warmth grew in her chest, a quiet tenderness that escaped in small gestures, in the way she adjusted the sheets, in the delicacy with which she changed the flowers, in the choice of music, in the stories whispered at night. She didn't know what it was, didn't dare name it, but it was real. Adrian was still in a coma. There were no promises, no gestures in return. And yet, she felt it. Felt with an almost frightening clarity that she cared for him in a way that went beyond professional duty. It was something deep, intimate, almost ancient, as if that feeling had been in her even before she knew his name. She lowered her eyes for a moment, searching for breath. Yes, she was falling in love, not with words, not with actions, but with the subtle presence that Adrian represented, with the silence that didn't hurt, with the feeling that even asleep, he listened to her. And as her reflection looked back at her, lighter, more alive, Helena understood that blooming wasn't an explosive act. Sometimes it was simply noticing a smile in the mirror and accepting that the soul, despite all the scars, had chosen to love again. The afternoon dragged on in silence, wrapped in the muffled sound of rain tapping against the mansion's windows. The air felt heavier that day, as if something was about to rise from the usual stillness. Helena, on her knees in Adrian's office, was organizing an old bookshelf that had long been neglected. The books were dusty and yellowed, and some papers had slipped between the shelves, falling into a small hidden compartment at the back of the cabinet. Curious, she pulled one of the loose boards and found a worn leather folder. The smell of old paper and dried ink filled the room, stirring an involuntary restlessness. As she opened the folder, her heart seemed to pause for a moment. The name of the orphanage where she had grown up was stamped on the dossier's cover. With trembling fingers, she flipped through the pages. Files with children's data, internal reports, and in the middle of it all, something even more unexpected. Her own file. There was her full name, the admission date, a childhood photo attached with a rusted paperclip. The handwriting on the reports looked cold, bureaucratic, but what truly took her breath away came next. Financial spreadsheets, bank receipts, and formal letters revealed that the orphanage had been supported, for many years, by anonymous donations. And at the bottom of one of the oldest documents, almost faded by time, was a signature, Adrian Lancaster. The name carved itself into her mind like a silent blade. Helena instinctively recoiled, as if the paper had burned her. It couldn't be a coincidence. This wasn't just another job, and he wasn't just another man in a coma under her care. He had been present in her life long before they had ever met, silently, from a distance, but with intention. A wave of confusion washed over her. What did he know about her past? Why had he helped her without her knowing? Was it just philanthropy? Or was there something more? Some hidden connection between them that she had yet to understand? The ground beneath her feet felt less steady now. The quiet trust she had built between them began to unravel under the weight of this discovery. For the first time in weeks, Helena didn't know what to feel as she looked at him sleeping in the next room. Gratitude? Fear? Betrayal? The questions sprouted like thorns. But one thing was certain, none of this was by chance. And in that moment, as she clutched the papers tightly, as if she could extract the truth from the pages, Helena realized that the past she had tried so hard to bury was, in fact, more alive than ever, and that Adrian, even unconscious, had far more to do with her story than she had ever imagined. The folder didn't end. Each new envelope, each crease in the paper, hid more fragments of a story Helena had never imagined would be so intertwined with Adrian's. After discovering the signature, her eyes were already burning, not just from the accumulated dust, but from the flood of emotions threatening to break her composure. Among the documents, she found a new set of photographs printed on old paper, children gathered at simple events, yet full of color, holding hand-painted signs, running across a lawn with makeshift kites. They were images of genuine joy, the kind of rare joy that only survives in places where hope is cultivated with great effort. Helena recognized some of those children. Some had been her dorm mates. Others were faces time had nearly erased from memory. And there, right in the center of one of the photos, was herself, sitting with a book in her lap, surrounded by little ones, telling a story with a focused expression. It was a version of Helena she barely remembered. So young, so alive, so unconsciously full of dreams. Attached to the photo was a social impact report signed by former educators from the orphanage. One page highlighted a paragraph that Helena read with trembling hands. Among our children, we highlight Helena S., a girl with a vivid imagination and a natural talent for storytelling. She organizes impromptu reading sessions for the younger ones, invents alternate endings for classic tales, and has already expressed the dream of becoming a writer. She is the creative soul of the group. Helena leaned against the wall, feeling the weight of that moment pass through her. She had buried that dream so deep that at times she doubted it had ever really existed. And now, here it was, validated by adults who believed in her long before she believed in herself. The report continued with details about an orphanage revitalization program funded by an external project. The same name appeared throughout the documents: Adrian Lancaster. He hadn't just kept the place running during a crisis. He had funded programs for art, literature, and psychological care. In a world of silence and loss, Adrian had been the invisible presence that ensured the childhoods of dozens of children, including hers, weren't destroyed. Helena felt a lump in her throat. This wasn't just a revelation about Adrian's past. It was a mirror turned toward her own story, now illuminated by a light she never knew existed. He wasn't just the man in a coma with whom she had formed an unlikely bond. He was, somehow, the reason for one of the few happy periods in her life. And in the middle of all the confusion, fear, and doubt, a single certainty gently crept in. She was more connected to him than she had ever imagined, and perhaps had always been. The following days were enveloped in a thick, almost sacred silence. The mansion seemed to hold its breath, as if the very space understood the weight of Helena's discoveries. She no longer knew if she was searching for answers, or simply following an internal, instinctive call that led her to comb through every corner, like someone piecing together a puzzle left unfinished by someone who never got the chance to complete it. It was in a hidden drawer behind the office bookshelf, concealed by a false wooden back darkened with time. that she found the envelope. Yellowed, sealed with cracked wax, and with her name, Helena, written by hand in firm, slightly right-leaning script. Her heart stopped for a moment. Her hands hesitated. It felt like touching something no longer of this world, a bridge between past and present built in secret. She opened it carefully, afraid that the simple act of breaking the seal might shatter something inside her. The letter was long, written with restrained emotion, as if each word had been weighed before being placed on the page. If this letter ever reaches you, it's because I finally achieved what I most longed for, to find you. For years, I dreamed of that little girl with watchful eyes who read stories to other children, who used her imagination as both escape and shield. I saw her only once, but I never forgot. Helena paused, the paper trembling in her fingers. Her throat was dry. Her mind rushed through images that came flooding back. A tall man in a light suit visiting the orphanage when she was maybe 8 or 9. She remembered him as a distant figure, someone who had smiled at her from afar while she read to the younger kids. I invested in that orphanage because I believed in second chances. But it was you who made me believe there was still beauty in broken things. Your quiet strength, even at such a young age, moved me more than you could ever imagine. Since then, I've been searching for you. I found out you've had a hard life, and that pains me. I wish I had done more. I'm close now. So close. And I hope that, if we meet, you'll allow me to truly know you. Adrian. Helena pressed the letter to her chest, her face wet with tears. She didn't know if she was crying for him, for herself, or for everything they hadn't lived. His words echoed everything she had been saying to him during her readings, in her late-night confessions, as if, in some inexplicable way, he had heard her even before falling asleep. It was the missing piece, the confirmation that the bond between them wasn't a product of her imagination, but a secret thread fate had stitched over the years, until it finally placed them in the same space, even if one was motionless and the other trying to survive her own ghosts. And in that moment, as she reread the letter in silence, Helena understood. Adrian knew her. He had always known her. And maybe deep down, she had always known him too. The atmosphere in the mansion had shifted. The mornings no longer brought the same serenity as before. The sky remained overcast, as if announcing a storm not just in the weather, but in Helena's heart. She felt, with an intuition that defied logic, that something was moving behind the scenes, a force that didn't want her to keep uncovering the past. It was then that Dr. Augusto appeared, suddenly, on a particularly gray afternoon. His voice was as polished as ever, his expression serene, but his eyes, there was something in them Helena had never noticed before, a restrained tension, almost a disguised desperation. He asked her to talk in the mansion's old office, where the walls still smelled of ether and bottled memories. He sat down with a folder in his hands, like someone carrying a sentence. The air was heavy. "You need to know what he didn't tell you, Helena." The impact of the words was immediate. She stiffened, as if her name had been pulled out from inside a secret. Dr. Augusto opened the folder slowly, revealing an old photograph, 2 children. A boy with a serious look, Adrian, and next to him, a delicate-looking girl with a faint smile. He pointed to her. This was his sister, Clara. She died in a fire at the orphanage, the same one where you grew up. Helena felt the ground open beneath her feet. Her stomach twisted, her heart raced. She had never known Adrian had a sister, never heard anything about a fire. But the doctor continued, his words as sharp as scalpels. Adrian became obsessed with finding out the real cause of the tragedy, and there was only one witness who disappeared after that night. You. That statement hit Helena like a blade. She tried to protest, but he was faster. He pulled another sheet from the folder, an old newspaper clipping, with a tragic headline and the name of the orphanage. Next to it, a handwritten note. Find her. Understand why. Written by Adrian. You think he was looking for you out of love? Said Dr. Augusto coldly. The truth, Helena, is that he believed you had something to do with his sister's death. You were the girl who was with Clara moments before the fire started. He wanted justice. He wanted answers, not reconciliation. The words echoed in her mind like muted thunder. Everything she had built in the past few weeks, the connection, the affection, the quiet hope, began to collapse like a house made of glass. Helena could no longer distinguish truth from manipulation. But the pain was real. A sharp, treacherous pain that seemed to swallow everything she believed in. She left the room staggering, her eyes blurred. Adrian's face, once a symbol of peace and silent complicity, now seemed to hide something dark. Everything was tainted by doubt, by the possibility that the man she was beginning to love had never had pure intentions, and that her presence there had always been part of a cruel reckoning. Alone in the hallway, she leaned against the wall, breathless. It was as if someone had turned off the light inside her. The world was collapsing, and this time, there was no silence to comfort her. The mansion, once a place of quiet rituals and tender rediscoveries, had now become a labyrinth of shadows. Helena walked through the corridors like an unwelcome visitor to her own story. The faces in the portraits on the walls seemed to watch her, not with tenderness, but with silent judgment. The conversation with Dr. Augusto still echoed in her mind, like an open wound that refused to heal. She locked herself in the guest room, where she sometimes slept when staying up to care for Adrian. She sat on the floor beside the bed, curled up, hugging her knees. There was a slight tremor in her fingers, not from the cold, but from within, the kind of tremor that comes when the body tries to contain a truth that refuses to be denied. She closed her eyes, and then the memory came. A flash, the smell of smoke, muffled screams, fragmented images that surfaced like ghosts from a poorly buried past. She had been just a girl when the fire destroyed part of the orphanage. She had always thought it was an accident, a short circuit, a forgotten candle. But now, with Augusto's lie, everything was tainted. Was there really another child with her that night? She couldn't remember clearly. She only felt the heat, the panic, and then the silence. The doubt took root, and in the void left by the absence of answers, the most familiar monster emerged. Guilt. An internal voice, subtle and cruel, began to whisper that maybe Dr. Augusto was right, that maybe Adrian had truly sought her out in anger, not tenderness, and that she, no matter how hard she tried to love, care, rebuild, was deep down the origin of others' pain. The words she had read in Adrian's letters now seemed to carry a different weight. And every act of care, every book read aloud, every song played on the piano, all of it could have been a cruel irony, a bond built over the abyss of deception. Helena's heart, so sensitive and already full of scars, sank into an internal swamp. She was emotionally exhausted, on the brink of collapse. That night, she didn't seek comfort in Adrian's room. She remained lying in complete silence, staring at the ceiling as if it could offer her some kind of explanation. The tears came quietly, as if they no longer had the strength to fall. A part of her believed she deserved this suffering, that something had been broken inside her since childhood, something that attracted tragedy, that made love, whenever it appeared, turn into pain. It was the beginning of a dangerous descent, a confrontation with the darkest parts of herself. The early morning fell like a thick veil over the mansion, wrapping everything in silence and mist. The wind stirred the curtains and whispered through the trees, as if the night itself knew that something was about to break. Helena walked through the room in slow, calculated steps, each movement weighed down by something invisible. Her bags were already packed, not large, just enough to make it seem like a practical departure. But inside, it was an escape, a desperate attempt to flee the collapse forming within her. On the nightstand in Adrian's room, she left a carefully folded piece of paper. No long speech, no accusations, just one sentence. I need to protect us both from more pain. She couldn't write more than that. Her hands trembled, her eyes burned, and any word beyond those would have felt like a plea, and she was tired of pleading, even silently. Before leaving, she passed the slightly open door of the room where he lay. For a moment, she hesitated. She wanted to go in, to look at him one last time, maybe touch his hand, whisper something like a goodbye her heart would understand, even if his mind couldn't. But she stopped. She felt that if she crossed that door, she wouldn't have the strength to leave. So she walked through the dark hallways of the mansion, where each step seemed to echo recent memories. Muffled laughter, readings aloud, piano melodies. All of that now felt like part of a time she wasn't sure had been real, or merely a construction of her own hope. Each memory sounded like a mistake. When the front door closed behind her, the silence was so absolute it felt final. The car waiting at the gate pulled away slowly, leaving behind the silhouette of the sleeping house. From the back seat, Helena looked one last time through the rear window, wishing, against everything she felt, that he would wake up, notice her absence, call her back. But the iron gate closed slowly, like a heart deciding never to open again. Deep down, there was still a flicker that wanted to believe that if he truly loved her, he would come after her. But she had already convinced herself that it had all been a mistake. The touches, the gestures, the signs. Maybe they were just involuntary responses of a body, not the heart. And so she left, with the bitter taste of a love that may have never existed, or worse, one that existed in the wrong way, wounded, tainted from the start. The night swallowed her figure without witnesses, and love, the one that had bloomed in silence, now got lost in the fog of doubt. The room dawned in an unusual stillness, as if even time itself had hesitated to move forward. Soft light filtered through the half-open curtains, brushing gently against Adrian's face. His eyes opened slowly, more focused than before. There was a different weight in the air, not physical, but emotional. He sensed something was out of place, as if a vital and essential part of the space had vanished. He tried to move his head slowly, and his gaze wandered around the room in search of a familiar presence. There were no books stacked on the dresser, no sound of the voice that, night after night, had filled the silence with made-up stories and whispered smiles. He tried to speak, his voice still rough, weak, but the sound came out, even if barely audible. "Helena?" No one answered. Shortly after, the nurse entered the room with the first tests of the day. When she saw him awake, she smiled, surprised, but her expression quickly softened into compassion when he mumbled her name again. And it was then, with a sorrow she couldn't hide, that she told him the truth. Helena had left during the night, without leaving an explanation, without even saying goodbye. The emptiness that opened inside him was immediate, piercing. It was different from the numbness of the previous days. It was conscious absence. It was abandonment. Her name echoed inside his mind like a broken whisper, like a letter that never arrived. Not caring about the pain burning through his dormant muscles, Adrian tried to move. He forced his arm, then his legs, while the nurse tried to hold him back. But he kept pushing. The body that once slept now seemed to cry out for action. It was no longer about physical therapy or clinical progress. It was urgency. It was desperation. It was longing. He felt, with a clarity no medicine could explain, that something between them had broken, an invisible thread that had held them together, even in silence. But he also felt that the thread hadn't snapped. It had only been stretched to the point of pain. Maybe there was still time. Maybe it was still possible to reconnect what Helena believed was lost. With superhuman effort, he sat up for the first time without help. Sweat poured down his forehead and his chest heaved, but his eyes, now alert and filled with anguish, reflected something no one had seen before. He was awake, fully, and ready to fight. Outside, the sky was still gray, as if the world itself were also in suspense. But inside Adrian, the silence had been shattered, not by words, but by the pain of a love in flight, and by the certainty that he had to bring her back. The sound of a heart monitor filled the room with its steady rhythm. The morning outside was dark, as if the sky were still silently weeping. Adrian woke slowly, like someone rising from a deep, murky sea. His heavy eyelids opened with effort, revealing dull but living eyes. His body still felt like a prison, rigid and fragile, but there was something different: awareness. His breathing was short, uneven, as if the act of being awake demanded too much. The images around him were blurred, faces indistinct. Voices emerged like distant echoes, medical, technical, shapeless questions. But one of them stood out, faint and aching, like a sound rising from within. Helena. He whispered the name as if entrusting his soul to the wind. The word was hoarse, almost imperceptible, but real. It was his first word in days, and it wasn't a random name. It was the anchor. It was the absence that burned. It was the presence that hurt. A nurse approached, in disbelief, her eyes welling up when she realized he had spoken. She tried to stay calm, jotting down signs, calling the doctors. But before any formal question, she followed her heart. She asked if he remembered anyone. The man who had been in absolute silence slowly turned his head with effort, stared at the ceiling, and answered in a dragged-out voice, The girl with the books. Where is she? The response was filled with tenderness and loss. There were no doubts, no clinical rationality. It was pure emotion. That wasn't just a sign of memory. It was a fragment of his soul emerging after being held back for so long. He didn't say a name, a last name, or a role. He spoke of feeling, of a presence that had reached him in the dark, night after night. The room then sank into another kind of silence, a thick silence, heavy and full of life. It was the beginning of a full awakening, not just physical, but emotional. It was confirmation that, even in her absence, Helena still lived inside him, not as a vague memory, but as a love that refused to die. From that moment on, everything would change, not because of any medical or technical decision, but because Adrian had returned, and with him, a heart searching for the only person who gave meaning to this new beat. The hospital room, once dull and motionless, now carried a nearly imperceptible tension, like the air before a storm. Adrian, still with a weak voice and limited movements, looked around as if searching for something invisible, a trace, a silhouette, a scent. But there was only absence. When he asked about the girl with the books, the nurse hesitated. The time between the question and the answer seemed to stretch, as if the universe itself wanted to protect him from the coming pain. With a held-back sigh, she stepped closer, gently holding his hand. She spoke with the tenderness of someone handling something too fragile to break. Helena was gone. She left in the middle of the night. She left a letter. She didn't say goodbye. Adrian's chest reacted before his mind could process it. A tightness, almost physical, as if the air had disappeared for a second. What had moved him silently, night after night, was now gone. And worse, she had left without giving him a chance to explain, to understand, to fight. With tremendous effort, he asked for his own files. He pointed to the locked drawer that held his belongings, papers, old letters, what was left of his past. And among the papers carefully handed to him was Helena's letter. Short, unfinished, deeply painful. As he read each word, Adrian's eyes didn't blink. The world around him ceased to exist. The sentences she had written were like subtle daggers. I need to protect us both. I can't keep pretending I don't see. Maybe I was never more than a reflection of your past. There was fear. There was pain. But above all, there was surrender. And that was what hurt the most. He realized then, with growing bitterness, that Helena hadn't left because she stopped loving him, but because she believed he never truly loved her. And the reason why was clear between the lines. She had been manipulated. Someone had planted doubts. Someone had twisted the facts. And the cruelest part, she believed it. Believed it so deeply that she didn't even give him a chance to explain. That was what weighed most. Not the absence, but the lack of trust. The fragility of the bond that connected them, broken not by truth, but by a lie. At that moment, Adrian was no longer just a man waking from a coma. He was a man who had lost something irretrievable, the purity of a love that, even in silence, had been real. And now, all that was left was to piece together the truth and go after the woman who made him want to live again. The room remained shrouded in dimness, as if time inside it followed a different logic. Everything was silent, except for the sound of Adrian's heavy breathing and the soft beeping of the monitors that registered his fragility. But that morning, there was something different in his eyes. A spark awakened, a sense of urgency that didn't come from physical pain, but from the emptiness left by Helena. Her absence had ignited in him the only flame capable of defeating the darkness. The need to find her, to bring her back, to prove it wasn't too late. Ignoring the medical team's recommendations, Adrian pushed aside the sheet that covered him. His legs, still weak, trembled from the simple effort of rising from a horizontal position. The floor felt more distant than ever. Every muscle ached. Every inch of skin screamed. But he didn't hesitate. He planted his hands on the bed rails, took a deep breath, and tried to stand. The first attempt ended in a fall, loud, harsh, humiliating. His body collapsed, and for a moment the world spun, but he didn't call for help. Alone, with his chest heaving and his eyes fixed on the blind spot on the wall, he whispered something just to himself. She believed in me. That phrase wasn't just a memory. It was an anchor. With enormous effort, he leaned against the nearby piece of furniture. Tried again. His knee gave out. The impact of the second fall was even more brutal. The dull sound of his body hitting the floor shattered the silence like a muffled thunderclap. But he didn't scream. He didn't cry. He just lay there, staring at the ceiling, until an almost invisible force pushed him once more. Love was no longer just a memory. It was fuel. And in that silent stubbornness, in that pain transformed into strength, the audience saw something sublime. The faith of a man who, though broken, was rebuilding himself to be worthy of the love he had nearly lost. At last, with his body hunched and fingers clinging to the edge of the bed, Adrian stood. For one full second, he simply breathed. It wasn't glory. It wasn't victory. It was surrender. And for the first time since the coma, he believed in something greater than himself. He whispered, "Now I'm the one who believes in her." And with slow steps, he began to walk toward the truth, toward Helena. Adrian's office was a time capsule, full of memories that had silently piled up over the years in which the past had been buried. The soft morning light filtered through the tall windows, casting shadows over leather-bound shelves, dense stacks of books, and forgotten cardboard boxes. Guided by an almost instinctive intuition, Adrian opened a side cabinet, dragging out a dark wooden chest covered by a thin layer of dust. Unlocking the latch felt like opening an old wound, and, at the same time, a portal to truths long buried. Inside the box was a bundle of carefully stacked letters, all addressed to the orphanage. The handwriting was his, youthful, marked by the anguish and urgency of a boy seeking answers, reconnection, perhaps redemption. Letters sent over the years, trying to stay in touch with the girl who had never left his memory, a girl with watchful eyes and a restless soul, but none had been answered. None had even been opened. The seals remained intact, as if the institution had chosen to erase him from her story. Beneath the letters rested a worn-out folder, its edges warped and papers yellowed with time. When he opened it, Adrian found old newspaper clippings, reports about the orphanage fire, sensationalist headlines, images of the charred ruins. But among them, an internal report from the time, hidden and marked as confidential. His eyes scanned each line with the urgency of someone seeking meaning in chaos. And then, there at the bottom of one of the documents, came the revelation. The fire had been caused by a severe electrical failure, neglected for months by the administration. To avoid losing sponsorships and private donations, the incident had been covered up. No child had been at fault. No childish prank. No Helena. The truth hit him like a blow, but also like liberation. The weight of guilt, carried for years, dissolved. Helena wasn't just innocent. She had been silenced, just like him. They had been victims of a system that chose silence over truth. And now, standing before that chest, Adrian understood the depth of the bond that connected them. A bond made of absence, of injustice, and of failed attempts to reunite, but also of love that had survived without words. The chest, once a symbol of forgetting, had become an altar of truth, and Adrian, with tearful eyes, knew what he had to do. Not just find Helena, but return to her what should never have been taken, the peace of knowing she was never to blame. The sun had barely crept over the horizon when Adrian appeared in the mansion's foyer, leaning on an improvised cane and with a more determined expression than he had ever worn. His body ached with every step, his muscles still relearning how to support him, but his mind was consumed by one idea. He needed to find her. The silence of the house contrasted with the storm within his chest. He knew, with fierce clarity, that every second of hesitation was a missed chance at reconnection. The nurse, who had been with him since the beginning of his recovery, rushed to him the moment she saw him heading toward the door. She tried to stop him, pleading with reason, with medicine, with fear, told him he could barely walk, that the trip might cost him his recovery, or worse. But Adrian, with steady eyes and a low voice, responded with the conviction of someone who would no longer let fate decide for him. "I've been away from her for too long." He ordered the driver to prepare the car. No one dared to oppose him. As he left, he carried only a small suitcase, the chest of documents that now held the truth, and a blue-covered notebook Helena had left behind in the guest room. It was the notebook where she had sketched her book, an intimate universe, made of lines and words that revealed more about her than any conversation ever could. Each page was a silent confession, a piece of pain and hope she'd never had the courage to say aloud. And now, he held it like a map to find her, as if the stories she wrote were clues she had left behind for him to finally understand her. As the car passed through the mansion gates, Adrian looked out the window one last time. The world he had known seemed to crumble, and at the same time, take on new meaning. For the first time in years, it wasn't the businessman or the heir making decisions. It was just a man trying to repair what had been broken, to reclaim what should never have been lost. And every mile ahead wasn't driven by blind hope, but by the certainty that even if it took a lifetime, he had to try. The road stretched ahead of the car like a thin line between past and present. Inside the vehicle, silence reigned. No sound but the soft hum of the engine, the tires gliding over asphalt damp from the early morning rain, and Adrian's tense breathing, heavy, almost restrained. He refused to close his eyes. Time couldn't be wasted on rest. Every mile traveled was an open wound, and at the same time, an attempt to heal. The landscapes passed like shadows outside the window. Small towns, isolated houses, fields still asleep under mist. Everything seemed still, except for the whirlwind unraveling inside him. Adrian stared out the window, but he saw far more than the present allowed. In his mind, images of Helena appeared with cruel clarity, her quiet laugh among books, her eyes lost in daydreams, the restrained gestures that revealed so much even when she tried to hide everything. He remembered the conversations between the lines, the shared silences, the nights they pretended not to care when the bond between them was already undeniable. And now, here he was, crossing cities in search of the woman who had left without explanation, but had left behind a trail that still burned. As they passed the outskirts of the orphanage where everything began, Adrian asked the driver to stop. The old building, partially renovated, still bore the marks of time, and of the fire that had nearly changed destinies forever. He walked slowly through the courtyard, his eyes scanning every detail: the low wall where the children used to sit, the dried-up garden, the dull stained glass of a deactivated chapel. Upon entering, the scent of old wood and memories overwhelmed his senses. His hands touched one of the walls in the main hallway, and at that exact point, he recalled the fleeting moment, years ago, when he first saw Helena, a solitary child, her eyes fixed on a notebook, writing as if that were all she had. And maybe it was. He stayed there for minutes that felt like hours. He felt the weight of the unfulfilled promise, of the protection he never managed to offer, of the time they lost to secrets and silence. But in that moment, amid the echo of his own footsteps and the emptiness of the orphanage, he made a promise, not to the past, but to what could still be built. This time, I won't lose her. The phrase wasn't spoken aloud, but it echoed inside him like a pact. And with that vow carved into his chest, he returned to the car. The road ahead was still long, but the direction was clear. He was no longer adrift. The salty breeze brushed Adrian's face before he even saw the sea. The car had stopped in the center of a modest village, hidden between hills and cliffs, where time seemed to move slower. The narrow streets, with weathered wooden houses and clotheslines swaying with simple garments, exuded a stillness that contrasted with the restlessness consuming him inside. He walked with hesitant steps, his body still weak from recovery, but sustained by a force deeper than any muscle: the desire to find her again. Helena. She was there. He felt it, not as a rational certainty, but as a truth that pulsed with the same rhythm as the waves crashing against the nearby rocks. He asked a weathered old fisherman, with rough hands and tired eyes, for directions. The man stared at him in silence for a few seconds before nodding toward the top of the cliff, where a narrow trail disappeared into the harsh green of the rocks and the darkening sky. "If she's here, that's where you'll find her," the man said with a hoarse voice, as if sharing a secret from an ancient world. Adrian nodded slightly and walked on without hesitation. Every step on that trail was a negotiation between pain and hope. His leg faltered every few meters. His breathing grew heavier, but none of it would make him stop. The strong wind howled between the rocks, as if it carried the accumulated longing of two broken hearts. He remembered the stories she had told, scattered fragments about childhood in that village, about the nights she hid from the world at the cliff's edge, listening only to the sea. Now he understood. That place wasn't just a refuge, it was a mirror of her soul, and it was where he needed to be. When he reached the top, the sound of the waves crashing below blended with the rapid pounding of his heart. The sky was gray, heavy, but it didn't threaten rain. It was just the kind of day when the world seems to breathe sorrow. He paused for a moment, chest heaving, eyes scanning the horizon for any sign of her. He didn't know what he would find, if she even wanted to be found. But he was there, whole, stripped of pride, carrying in his hands the notebook she had left behind, and in his heart the promise he had made in silence. He wouldn't let her slip away again. The sand was damp beneath Helena's feet, molding to the contours of her body as if the earth itself wanted to embrace her in silence. The sky, painted in muted shades of gray and blue, hovered above the vast, immense, unreachable sea. Sitting sideways, knees close to her chest, she watched the constant movement of the waves, as if searching in them for answers no one else could give. In her delicate hands, marked by salt and time, she held a pale seashell, with childish markings etched in graphite, A and H. She didn't remember how it had ended up there. It was as if the shell had risen from the past to find her again, brought by the tides of memory. In the dream she'd had the night before, she had seen two young faces by the sea, shy laughter, fingers dirty with sand, the shell being buried with the promise that if they ever got lost, the sea would bring them back together. Helena no longer knew if the dream was real or a creation of her broken heart, but there she was, and there was the shell, and in that instant, everything made sense. The pain, the absence, the missed chances, it all seemed to converge on that patch of beach where the world stopped spinning. The cold wind cut against her skin, but she didn't move. She remained still, like a statue made of memories and silence, until, behind her, footsteps began to sound, slowly, heavy, dragging. At first the sound blended with the wind, but then it became distinct, like the beating of a heart drawing near. Helena didn't turn around. Something inside her froze, even her breath. She didn't know if it was the fear that it might be him, or the fear that it might not be. And then, as if the universe decided to exhale, she heard it. Helena. The voice was low, broken by the wind but unmistakable. A whisper from the edge of memory and time. Her name. Just that. And in that moment, the world seemed to dissolve. The shell slipped from her fingers, falling gently into the sand. Her eyes filled with tears, not from shock, nor from pain, but from the certainty that voice brought. He was there. Adrian. Not in a dream, not in memories. There. Now. Real and present. Like the promise buried years ago. She didn't turn. Not yet. She remained there, in an eternal second, just feeling his presence, as if that moment was more powerful than any word. The ocean breeze continued to blow between them, carrying salt, time, and unspoken memories. Helena finally turned, slowly, as if each movement was shaped by the fear that he might vanish. But he was there, standing just a short distance away, his eyes damp, reflecting hers like two mirrors finally recognizing each other after a lifetime of distortion. No words were spoken at first. None were needed. There was between them a communication that went beyond speech, a deep, almost ancestral recognition, as if the universe had waited for this exact moment to close an old cycle. Adrian staggered slightly, but leaned on nothing but his own will. His knees gave way, and he knelt in the sand, feeling the cold and pain pierce through him like silent spears. Even so, he kept his eyes on her, eyes of someone who, despite everything, never gave up remembering. With a slightly trembling hand, he reached out toward her. No rush, no demand. Just an offering, a small gesture, but one that carried the full weight of what they had lived, what they had suffered, what they now understood. Helena didn't step back. On the contrary, she moved one single step forward, and that was everything, because something inside her melted, like ice touched by the warmth of a name spoken at the right time. The silence between them wasn't uncomfortable. It was sacred. It was the space where pain transformed into forgiveness, and absence into presence. Then he whispered, his voice scratching like it rose from the ruins of his soul. "You protected me when no one else could see." Helena closed her eyes for a brief moment, not to escape, but to feel that moment sink deep, like a scar that finally stops hurting. When she opened them again, her eyes shimmered with more than tears. There was tenderness, acceptance, and truth. Her voice came out fragile, yet firm, carrying all the words she had never been able to say. And you heard me when no one else listened. They didn't need anything else. The memory they shared settled there, not as a rescued past, but as a present that finally made sense. Two hearts marked by the same absence, now finding rest in each other. They remained face to face, the sound of the sea serving as silent witness. Helena still held the shell between her fingers, as if it were the last link between past and present. But it wasn't. The real link stood before her, eyes wet, and voice finally freed from restraint. Adrian took a deep breath. It was time to share the truth, not as justification, but as redemption. He began to speak gently, like someone who knows that pain lives in every word, but that only by walking through it can healing be found. He said the social project was born from the need to make amends for mistakes he hadn't even known how to name at the time. That years before he knew her name, he had already seen her. A small girl sitting in the corner of a hallway at the orphanage, reading aloud to a group of younger children, while most adults hurried past without even noticing. He had just been a teenager passing through, brought to the orphanage by his mother during one of her rare attempts at public charity. But in that moment, he stopped. He stayed at a distance, hidden behind a column, listening to her voice fill the emptiness of that place with made-up stories, improvised poetry, and hope she perhaps didn't even feel herself. He said he never forgot that scene, that girl who read as if trying to fix the world with words, that for years, he held on to that memory as something almost sacred, without knowing who she was, without even understanding why it had touched him so deeply. And that when he saw her again, grown up, slight and silent, cleaning the floor of his office, something inside him shook, as if time had bent, returning to him what he himself had lost. Helena listened in silence, but her silence wasn't doubt. It was absorption. Each word fell on her like warm drops after a freezing storm. The tears streamed slowly, not just for him, but for everything she had believed about herself. She cried for the times she felt invisible, for the nights she believed she wasn't worthy of being remembered, of being loved, of being chosen. She cried for that girl with crooked braids who read with hope in a world where no one seemed to hear her. She cried because now she knew. Someone had heard her. Someone had never forgotten. Adrian then took a hesitant step closer, with the same care as someone gathering a shard of glass and turning it into stained glass. And he finished, looking into her eyes. "You changed my life before I even knew I had one. I just wanted to find a way to thank you, to reach you, but I ended up pushing you away, when all I wanted was for you to stay." She let the shell fall, landing softly in the sand. She didn't need to hold on to the past anymore. It was now part of the story, but it was no longer a prison. It was a bridge. The salty breeze kept blowing between them, but it was no longer cold. It held the warmth of something sacred, something that, even after so many breaks, had endured. Adrian didn't say anything else. The words had done what they needed to do. Now was the moment when the body spoke, when eyes said more than any sentence. He stepped closer slowly, as if honoring each step of that moment that seemed to exist outside of time. The sandy ground felt less steady than the certainty within him. Helena, standing with tears still in her eyes, didn't back away. She no longer needed to run. She had been found. The space between them, once filled with hurt and missed chances, now emptied slowly until there was nothing left but presence. A serene silence settled, and in that silence, he raised his hand, gently touching her face, like someone caressing a memory before making it real. Helena's eyes closed for a moment, not to escape, but to feel, to allow. And then, as if the years apart had been only preludes to a destiny finally fulfilled, Adrian leaned in and kissed her. It was a calm kiss, steady, full of truths and healed absences. There was no rush, no demand. It was the kiss of two hearts that had already chosen each other in silence, long before meeting again eye to eye. A kiss that didn't promise happy endings, but possible new beginnings. It was the kind of touch that brings the soul back to the body, that seals wounds left open for far too long, that says, without a sound, "Now you have somewhere to return to." Around them, the world seemed to quiet down. The ocean moved in and out in perfect cycles, as if it understood the importance of being a witness. The wind, once just wind, now sounded like an ancient greeting, a melody without lyrics, as if whispering through their hair. "You've arrived." And they had, indeed, arrived not just to each other, but to the most whole part of themselves. The part that, even wounded, still knew how to love. The kiss ended slowly, as if respecting the eternity it carried, but their eyes did not part. And there, on that cliff where Helena's childhood had begun, and her ghosts had once hidden, something new was born. Not a fairy tale, but a shared truth, full of love, imperfect, yet real.